Welcome everyone to the Justice Committee on Policing. This is our 9th meeting of 2019. We have apologies from Margaret Mitchell. I'd remind members and witnesses that the public session must conclude no later than 1:40 today, so that we can briefly consider a draft report on our work programme. So could I ask for succinct questions and answers, please? Agenda item 1 is our decision on taking business in private, and that relates to items 3 and 4, which are a consideration of a draft report and our work programme. Are we all agreed on that issue?
Agreed.
Thank you. And do members also agree that if we require to consider these items at a future subcommittee meeting, that we consider them in private session? Thank you very much indeed. Agenda item 2 is police custody provision, and I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome witnesses to today's meeting. Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen, Criminal Justice Service Division, Police Scotland, and Callum Steele, General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, and Lucille Ingalls, Unison Police Staff Scotland Branch Chairperson from Unison Scotland. You're all very welcome. And we'll move straight to business, and I'll start the questions. Can I ask the panel's views on custody transfers? For example, are the number of transfers at an acceptable level, and how many transfers would be likely to result in individuals having to travel long distances?
So, yes, I'm happy to kick off, Chair, if that's what, what you wish. Yep. As you'll recall, at the last 2 Justice Committees, we've mentioned transfers, and it is definitely a hot topic, but also, you know, of continual review for me as the Divisional Commander. Since the last time we were here, the transfer rate has reduced slightly compared to previous years, albeit only by 2% in the last 12 months, from sitting now at just over 4,200 transfers per year. And that might or might not sound excessive. It's 3.5% of the total custody demand. But then when you break down the transfers further, you actually see that a number of the transfers are not for operational or capacity reasons. It's actually more so because of other things that are now beginning to come to light through earlier identification of mental health, etc. And I have some figures here where there's been an increase in healthcare transfers. So healthcare provision, as members may recall from the last time, is not in every custody centre. So in the 77 custody centres we don't have healthcare provision, but what we have is acute healthcare provision in the main primary centres located across the country. So if a custody is brought in and he or she has distinct mental health issues, vulnerability issues, suicidal issues, then what we make that decision is to take them to the closest place to them, place to where they have been brought into custody, to ensure that they get the right medical support. So that's one of the reasons for the transfers. Another reason, which is 13% of the 4,200, is around nearest court. So a lot of individuals, not surprisingly, get locked up at one part of the country on a warrant perhaps, and actually are required the next lawful day at another part of the country. So rather than do that first thing in the morning, if we have the capacity and the resource to do it, then we'll do that at quieter times throughout the course of the day. The biggest chunk actually is around violence and risk. So we have observation cells in a number of our custody centres, but not in them all. So if we have a custody who is vulnerable or who is extremely violent, then we need to put them into constant observation. So we will make that decision to actually move them to the right custody centre that will meet their needs, and also that of my staff. In relation to transfer, which is a new development since the last time we were here, is it used to be it would be police officers and or my staff that would do the transfers, but since then we've secured a contract with GOAMI. We did that with the prison service, the courts and the Crown, and now at the weekend all the transfers are undertaken by the private contractor of GOAMI, so not by Police Scotland. So the abstraction that was once noted by Federation and others around the abstraction of officers to do the transfers is no longer the case. Those transfers are taken by the private company that have Home Office approved vehicles that are fit for purpose for transfers in certain distances. They're all set to a national criteria and strict guidelines. So I may pause there because I'm conscious of your time, but that's the current situation around transfers.
Thank you. Perhaps before I go to the other two, can I ask you specifically on that issue then of that contract? Because that's since February of this year that contract's been in place. And you say that it's part of the Scottish Court Custody and Prisoner Escort Service contract.
Yes.
And it's with GOAMI. And as I understand, it's to undertake up to 40 transfers at weekends.
Yes.
Have you exceeded that?
I did check that this morning, Chair, because I thought that might be a question that comes up. And since February, we've never exceeded the 40 transfers. For example, last weekend there was only 18 transferred across the country, and I didn't know the numbers, but I think my superintendent told me the week before it was 23. So we would, if we did exceed it, there would be cost implications, and that's the reason that we know we haven't exceeded it, because we haven't been billed for any additional cost.
Well, that's what I was therefore going to ask there. Is this in addition to the existing contract, presumably, so there's a cost associated with that?
No, this is the current contract. So if the 40 transfers is built into the agreed contract, if there was additional transfers required over and above that, then there would be cost implications, but we've never required to do that because we've never met the 40 transfers over the weekend.
And what is the contingency were you to exceed that number?
So what we'd do, there'd be two choices we could make. Clearly we've not had to make it yet, but would be one, we would pay the penalty or the additional cost of getting GOAMI to do it, or secondly we could revert to what was the situation pre-February of this year, which is my officers during that handover period on a Sunday afternoon, for example, we could deploy some of my staff to move the prisoners around, but fortunately we've never had to do that.
And just for clarity, is this a variation to an existing contract? Is this a new contract?
This is a new contract. So prior to February, it was G4S that had the contract for the 10 years before. So we've negotiated, I'm part of the multi-agency liaison group, negotiated a new contract with a new contractor, which is GOAMI, which took place in February.
Right, and I imagine you're going to tell me it's commercial in confidence, the cost-benefit analysis of that particular.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Back, sorry, to the original question on transfers, for comments from yourself, Mr. Steele.
Yes, thanks, Chair. The starting point has got to be that we're still moving people unnecessarily. Notwithstanding the reasons that were provided by Mr. McEwen to my right, had we adequate custody provision where we bring people into custody, we wouldn't need to move them at all. It's notable, in fact, I'm sure that I'm not the only person that will recall this, that in previous evidence sessions, that when we talked about the movement of prisoners, that only those that were non-violent and that were volunteering to be moved were those that were identified for being moved. But now we're apparently being told that it's those amongst the highest percentage, more than half, are those that are violent. Now, I fully appreciate and understand the reasons that are provided for moving prisoners. It's because of the footprint of the custody estate we've got. Now, I make no criticism of the fact that we have to do it, but in an ideal world, we absolutely wouldn't. And even listening to the provision that's contained within the contract, if it's 40 custodies in a weekend, and we have 52 weekends in a year, that's less than half the prisoners that we're moving. So the other 2,100 must be getting moved by police officers, or must be getting moved by the police service in some way, shape or form. That's just simple arithmetic, which comes at a considerable cost in its own right. And we also can't lose sight of the fact that many of our own vehicles, and this is not the fault of the Criminal Justice Service Department, our own vehicles are in a poor state of repair. And we're expected to move prisoners in vehicles that are far beyond the serviceable life that we would once upon a time have been replacing them at. And I remain concerned that that is the best way to treat people in police custody.
Thank you. Ms. Ingalls.
It's not such an issue for us because it has vastly reduced. I think we've got to bear in mind that we don't have purpose-built buildings, unfortunately. I mean, if you look at Kitty Brewster, everything's there on tap. So if there's issues for mental health observation, nurses being available, I think it's inevitable that some people are going to have to be moved. But it's certainly not to the extent that it was the last time I was here.
Thank you. And just to the panel, a brief comment, please, on human rights aspects of this. Are you content with that, Mr. McEwen, and the health and safety implications of this?
I am, Chair. You know, these are as I said, Home Office specified vehicles that GOA may have, but I think we need to remember that these are real people that have real acute needs, and if the healthcare provision is in St Leonard's and this individual is at Dalkeith and there is not a medical practitioner in that area, I think it's right from a police perspective that individual is going to be kept over the weekend or overnight. We move that individual to where the best healthcare and other wraparounds are around constant obs and CCTV, and that happens to be St Leonard. So I think it's the right thing to move them there to look after them the best that we can.
Ms Ingles?
Yes. It's a very high-risk area, and I am certainly concerned for our police staff that work in that. So if it's the case of somebody being at risk if they stay where they're brought in, or taken to somewhere where they're going to be safer, I think that's the thing to do. So I'm looking at from both the prisoner side of things, but also from the staff side of things.
Mr Steele?
Yeah, I'd just reiterate what I said a few moments ago, Convener, and that's, I understand the reasons for it, but the reasons come down to the fact that we haven't adequate provision where it should be.
Okay, thank you. Liam?
Just a brief supplementary, Convener, good afternoon, panel. You talked about the reasons for the journeys be taking place, the transfers taking place, and also talked about a slight reduction. My assumption would be, though, that the kind of geographic impact of those longer transfers is falling more onerously on some parts of the country than others, and I wonder whether you might be able to describe what that disparity is in terms of the impact.
Yeah, so you are right. I could give, I did have a look at Argyll and Bute, which is one of our most remote areas. So, previously there was 5 custody centres there: Oban, Campbellton, Loch Gilphead, Dunoon and Rothesay. And the medical provision there in Campbellton, Loch Gilphead, Dunoon and Rothesay is nil. There's nothing there. So, we will move the custodies to where the best provision is. But to put it in perspective, in Campbelltown, there's 177 prisoners per year, and that equates to half a person, if you can do such a thing, per day. So, to ask the health service to put a healthcare provision in Campbelltown where there's less than 1 person per day going in there, I would suggest they would say that is absolutely disproportionate. And I do think we need to make best use and use best value to demonstrate the best service. So for me, it is about understanding the geographical challenges and moving the most vulnerable, the most in need, to the areas with the best service, and the best service happens to be in the primary centres where there's the greatest demand of custodies.
Do any of the other panel want to comment on that? Or?
I think the comments have been, succinctly put by the Chief Superintendent. We have seen some dramatic reductions in the requirement to move in some parts of the country, arguably the north, where I think, if I don't mention it, the Chief Super certainly will, that there's, I think, about a 97% reduction in abstractions, and because of technology that provides some kind of remote supervision, which we may come on to. It's not a consistent picture across the whole country. It very much varies day to day.
Mr McEwen, is it the case then, as far as Police Scotland are concerned, that no one would be detained in custody where there wasn't a medical presence?
No, that's definitely not the case. But if there is somebody who's in custody and arrested and likely to, and the decision has been made to keep that individual for a duration, a significant period, then my view and our instruction is that that individual, if they have acute needs, if they have healthcare certain needs or mental health issues or are suicidal, then we need to take these people to the centres that have the best provision to suit their needs.
And if there's a prisoner, say for instance, taken in Campbellton, and Campbellton's a long way away from, and if they have none of these particular needs,
they'll stay there.
They'll stay there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Liam.
We're going to follow on to that. Right. Okay. Just going back to the issue around the hub approach to the custody units, it would be helpful maybe if you could set out, Chief Superintendent, the rationale, the vision behind creating that hub approach.
Yeah, certainly, and I did. So at this time, or the last time I was here, the hubs were just beginning to come into fruition, and I can't remember, I think it might have been yourself, Mr MacArthur, had talked around, or I'd mentioned 150 new members of staff that were coming in, and we had a really aggressive training plan, and you made mention around, well, do you think you'll meet the needs? Well, fortunately, and I'm proud to say on behalf of all my staff, as well as the training teams and TLD, etc. at the college, we did manage to recruit the 150 new members of staff within, actually before the agreed timeline of the end of last year. And the knock-on effect of that is a number of my police staff applied for these new enhanced roles, so that enabled me to recruit further CJPCSOs. To recap, the CJPCSO, where it differs from the PCSO, is that they have additional skill sets around case management, record management, production management, and what my aspiration has been in line with Unison and Unite is really to try and upskill our police staff across the country to, they are a permanent professional presence for me in custody centres where police officers come and go and move and develop. So my aspiration is to build a model where the majority of the staff are in there are police staff, professional CJPCSOs. So that is the key element of a hub. And in that hub, these individuals are omnicompetent in their ability to move across all functional areas within my division. So rather, as it used to be, if you looked after custodies, all you did was look after custodies. If you looked after productions, all you did was productions, case management, records, and so on. But now they are trained and skilled to move across all those functions, which enables me and my officers and staff to deploy them where there is the greatest need. So a hub environment is now where you have a morning meeting with the supervisor and they understand where the demands and the pressures are across all of the business, and they move the staff to meet those demands, and that's the premise of the hub. In addition to that, we got capital investment to allow us to put Wi-Fi into the hubs, which enabled us to have that mature discussion with a number of partners to encourage them to deploy themselves within our hubs. And there's really been some exceptional work in Aberdeen, Inverness, Falkirk around, we jointly secured big lottery funding of £400,000 in the last few months to actually deploy key workers that are able to signpost to custody. So rather than police officers having that discussion with custodies now about unemployment, mental health issues, literacy issues, we now have a key worker that does that and then makes the necessary referrals to the partner agencies whilst they're within the custody setting environment, addiction services and stuff like that. So that's the premise of the hub, and that's what we're trying to achieve. Some of the things have not managed to come to fruition. However, we had last year a commitment of just shy of £9 million in capital investment to then address some of the other issues around custody, which is around the delays in getting the custodies booked in. Now, one of the big delays for that is because a number of the custody centres don't have the right number of charge bars, so some might only have 2 charge bars, and if a custody is violent and it comes in, we can't use other charge bars. So what we're looking with that money was to develop and broaden out the custody centres to make them more accessible and increase the throughput quicker. Another part of that was to create custody holding areas. So if you can imagine, in some custody areas, there are queues of police officers at the back door, literally in cars with their custodies, because we don't have a holding centre. Whereas in Inverness or in Aberdeen, it is actually, you have a holding centre, so you can put 3 or 4 custodies in there and only have 2 police officers watching them as the other ones are being processed. Whereas in other areas, we don't have the holding areas for them, so we have to have local policing officers there waiting with their custody. So the capital investment has not come to fruition. It was withdrawn around about this time last year, unfortunately, and we're now back in the bidding process with our finance people to try and secure more funding for this year coming forward.
And that funding, from your perspective, is essential if you are to make the custody suites kind of fit for purpose going forward? I
mean, yes, I'm sure you've been shown round, and if not, I'd happily show the members round, but some of them are so prehistoric that they do need significant investment. And Police Scotland this year, it was just shy of 100 million capital they asked for at the beginning of this year, and they were given less than half of that. So Police Scotland had to prioritise their capital investment, and unfortunately for me, the decision, and I understand why, because it was for mobile and fleet, etc., but the capital monies that we had this year were withdrawn from me and reprioritised elsewhere.
I think colleagues will maybe come on to that before leaving the issue around the hub model. Be helpful to get the views of Colin Steele and Lucille Inglis in relation to whether or not this has overall improved the quality of the police custody, whether there's a consistency across the piece, or whether there are still concerns around either of those two aspects.
I think it's a mixed picture. I think the starting point is that in an ideal world, Police Scotland would not be operating a hub model for custody. And that's something that we cannot forget and we should not ignore. We would have the adequacy of provision across the country rather than having to take prisoners on distance to get to custody centres. And we've got to be careful when we talk about custody hubs that we don't create an illusion, and I know that Mr McEwen deliberately avoided doing so, creating an illusion that we're talking about places that are all singing and all dancing and at the very top end of what we should be providing. The care that officers and staff provide to those in custody is exceptional. I have no hesitation in saying that. But the custody hub model does create additional difficulties, the most notable ones being the length of time it takes to either get to them or to get prisoners processed through them. And in addition...
Sorry if I can interrupt, just going back to what Chief Superintendent was saying previously in relation to a question from the convener about, say, the throughput in Campbellton, for example, and where there's a specialist need, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's other medical issues. Is there an acknowledgement that in some instances providing the specialist support that would be needed in those instances in every custody suite is going to be impractical, and therefore, whether it's a hub model or however you describe it, there's going to be a need to transfer individuals to centres where they can get specialist support that they need?
Well, I think, Mr MacArthur, if I may, that very much depends on the assumption that only those that require medical intervention in these rural communities are those that the police have dealings with. I very much suspect that, like the rest of society, there are people in the entire peninsula that have mental health difficulties throughout the course of their normal working day, and they require some kind of health provision. One of the unfortunate realities is that at this point in time, we are hostages effectively to the provision that's provided by other services. Now, in those circumstances, I completely understand it, but I don't think that should be an acceptable position to concede. The obligation on the health services to make sure that there is adequate provision for the general populace is one that I believe we should encourage, rather than just expecting those that are having extreme acute episodes to expect to be helped by the police because they happen to come to our attention.
Yeah. Although even within health board areas, there will be a requirement to transfer patients around to centres where they can get more specialist support. So it's not presumably just simply an issue for the police service.
Yes, indeed. And not everyone that comes into custody has some kind of mental health difficulty.
Ms. Ingles?
Yeah, from our point of view, I mean, the hubs seem to be working well, and the feedback is more positive, certainly from staff. It's very dependent on making sure that we have enough staff on duty. Mobility clause, as you know, is in their contracts now. So although we're releasing police officers back to the beat, it's falling now on police staff because of the mobility clause, having to fill other areas that police officers would. And it's right that police officers go back to doing what they should be doing and we take over. I think we've still got, 18 vacancies, something like that, and I think there's about 14 ready to come in, so that will make a difference. It seems to be working well. I go back to Kitty Brewster because that is a purpose-built building. They have the tablets there now where we don't have sufficient funds, I believe, to roll that out where it's supposed to be. So more money would be appreciated, of course. So it seems to be working well, and I think staff are doing a good job and prisoners are being looked after properly.
And the
Yeah.
point again that Chief Superintendent was making in terms of the broadening of the role and the, I suppose, the upskilling in some
Yes,
respects.
definitely.
The response from staff to that approach has been positive.
Yes, it's good that they get, in my opinion, it's good that they get a breakaway because it is a high risk and pressured area at times. We have a meeting tomorrow, which is a programme board, and my quest there will be to see that our police staff going into likes of records, productions, etc., are being actually productive, and it's just not that they're seen to be there, you know, that they're doing a worthwhile job and it's helping out. So that's our next phase for that. I think you all need to keep in mind as well that not all the buildings are fit for purpose, and a lot of money has been spent on them trying to bring them up to, you know, so if we had an unending pot of money, the purpose built obviously for this type of plan would be ideal.
I think colleagues will touch on that. Over to you.
Yeah, we are strained for time. I'm grateful for the comments so far. You wanted in briefly?
Just briefly, Convener, I think it's important to remind ourselves that there is a world of difference between people with medical difficulties being moved under medical circumstances with medical supervision to those with medical difficulties being moved under police supervision, and there are unnecessary risks associated with the latter.
Okay, thank you. Rona.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon. Just wanted to briefly ask you a wee bit about backfilling and staff. We understand backfilling has reduced, and I'm wondering if this is if the new CJ PCSOs has contributed to that, and also do the PCSOs mean that local police officers, the increase in that mean that more local police officers can just go back to doing other duties, or does it not work like that?
Well, I would like to think that's where they're going, because that's where they belong. Certainly, with the CG, with the hubs, we're trying to obviously make sure that they are staffed. Once we get all our vacancies filled, that will tell us whether we've got the right number. I would say that across Police Scotland, in every sphere, there's not built in any resilience. So we're very much, you know, if everybody's at work and doing what they're doing, that's fine. But it wouldn't take much to turn it the other way because there's not the funding for the resilience. But I think it's certainly going in the right direction, and certainly our future, because we're all on the same page, I think that police officers need to come out of that environment altogether, and it be police staff that look after the care and welfare of prisoners. I think that's a step in definitely the right direction, and police officers back to what they should be doing.
Okay. Just for clarification for myself, the GO-AMI contract, is that just for the moving, the transport, or does that impact on what we're talking about in the custody units? And, you know, has that contributed to the less backfilling?
No, so they don't have a role in the care and welfare. What GMA do, they pick up the custodies. So anybody that's going to court, they'll take them from the police station to the court, and from the prison service to the court, and at the weekend they'll transfer our custodies between centres.
Yeah, fine. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Next, Fulton. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about the ancillary custody centres that I know that you've mentioned in relation to the local approach for Argyll and Bute. Is that something that, is it just for Argyll and Bute in more rural areas, or is that something that you'll be implementing across the country?
No, that is predominantly, if not solely, designed for the rural areas, and it is just simply because of the demand. So going back to the Argyll and Bute area, what we had previously, and literally up until the last sort of few weeks, was 5 centres open 24/7 with custody staff, and sometimes if custody staff are on holiday or sick, then there'd be local policing officers in there. But then when you look at the demand, as I articulated just earlier there is, in my mind, no justification for keeping a centre open 24/7 for less than half a person going through every day. So what we've done in conjunction with the local policing commander there is we've looked to try and build a model that will allow him or his officers to be back at the front line. We've secured 2 additional posts into Oban Custody Centre to strengthen that, and we're making that the primary centre. The basis for the other 4, however, is that if there's a custody goes into Campbelltown and that custody is likely to be interviewed arrested and released and not being kept for court, then we can stand up that centre as what's called an ancillary centre with local policing trained custody staff who'll do that. If, however, the decision is that custody is going to be kept for 2 days over the weekend, then that custody would be transported to Oban, where we would look after them, thus releasing the local policing staff back to the front line.
Okay, and is the length of time the major consideration in these situations, or would it be if the individual was maybe violent or vulnerable, for example, would they be able to be kept at the ancillary centre?
No, it depends on the absolute circumstances, but observations, I wouldn't be having it ancillary unless it was for a very short period of time, i.e., you know, half an hour until the interview. We try and be sort of reasonable in the approach to that. But no, if custodies are violent, vulnerable or suicidal, then these ancillary centres are not, in my view, a safe place for them to be kept.
Okay, and if I could ask one quick question, Convener, I know that we're tight for time in my own area. Lanarkshire, I know that you've got the custody suites at Coatbridge in my own constituency. Motherwell and Lanark, is that a format that you think's working well, particularly maybe possibly at busy times or busier times?
Yeah, certainly we invested quite a bit of staff, as you may know, into those centres. That's where I think it was 15 of our CJPCSOs went there to strengthen that. So as I do speak to the local commander there, I never actually brought the breakdown per division, but it is substantial, the reduction in local policing officers going in there. So overall, I think somebody touched on it. I mean, it's 75% less frontline police officers are in my centres now backfilling than there was this time last year. So it is a massive reduction, and these officers are returned to their local policing command areas to be deployed as their commanders see fit.
Okay. Do you see any further demands on these particular centres in Lanarkshire, perhaps when there's major events in the central belt area, Glasgow, perhaps, such as an Old Firm game?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, you know, with the climate conference next year, we are now beginning to gear up and understand, or try to understand the implications of that. We had officers down at the Extinction Rebellion events in London, and you know, it's massive. The significance of this and the impact on custody could potentially be absolutely massive. So we are now already in the scoping phase of looking at what other centres we have shut or have been mothballed over the last 10-15 years to see if we're going to have to invest money in CCTV and actually get these centres back up to a reasonably good standard, because you know, hopefully the same numbers will not be reflected as it was down south, but if it is, then we're talking many hundreds of people. So we're already beginning the planning stage to try and look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Jenny.
Callum Steele, in your evidence, the SPF highlight an issue whereby disputes can sometimes arise over what responsibilities lie with custody officers and which lie with arresting and escorting officers. I wonder, is that a significant concern for the SPF?
Yes, is the short answer to that, if I may be so blunt. And primarily that usually comes down to the question of responsibility at the time decisions are taken about whether prisoners are to be placed under watch or some form of enhanced supervision, usually in simple terms suicide watches. And that responsibility tends to fall almost exclusively on the officers that have the misfortune of taking the individual to the custody centre. And that's the return on investment from the PCSOs to undertake that activity, which was understood to be one of the very fortunate benefits that would come, does not appear to have been realised just yet. And the difficulty that creates for local policing is fairly significant, because the responsibility for the people in care sits with this Criminal Justice Service Department whilst they're in custody, and that can result in tensions between the local policing response and needs versus the custody response and needs.
Both Police Scotland and the SPF both mentioned the PC-led custody centres in their written evidence, and I wonder if you could say more on how these centres currently operate and how they differ from other custody centres.
Yes, certainly. Well, they are, as their name suggests, they are PC-led. They don't have direct supervision involved in them. I think it's fair to say that after some fairly hefty teething problems, which is probably the polite way of describing it, that you know, in close conjunction with the staff associations and the service, that many of the early difficulties are in the process of being put right. my sense and our view was that they were rushed into being, and people were put into them without necessary training and consideration of the risks. It tends to, what the best example we've got tends to be in the north, the far north, where remote technology allows effectively remote supervision to take place. But whilst and in time monitoring in terms of activities within cells as well. But I do have concerns that there are some vulnerabilities in that those that have the supervisory responsibility are supervising facilities that they do not know other than on the end of a TV lens, which I hope doesn't result in any problems, but I rather fear at some point in the future will.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr.
Yeah, I mean, PC-led, I think the points made by the Federation are absolutely acceptable. In the north and the west, PC-led has been ongoing since time immemorial. So the officers there in the west and the north of the country, it's been happening. In the east, it was a cultural change issue, and we could have communicated that with my staff better. That was a year ago now. And now since then there has been massive engagement, risk assessments are in place, protocols are in place, site visits for supervisors who are doing the work remotely has been enabled, and they've been down at these remote centres so they understand the layout. So we are working very closely with our staff and staff associations to make sure that this works. I do think it's the right thing, however, because the sergeant that previously, for example, was at Hoyk, is now at St Leonard's. We've not got rid of that post. St Leonard's throughput is massive in relation to custodies compared to some of the remote areas. So the sergeant's remotely authorised, but the care and welfare is still done by our CJPCSOs or PCSOs and our police officers. So I think it's a better, more proportionate way to manage the demand in a safe environment. And since then, finally, just about resources, since I was last here, we've put an additional 25 team leaders, so CJPCSO team leaders, so first line supervisors now, we have them in our custody establishments across the country, and we've also recruited an additional 10 sergeants posts. So since I was here last year, that's 35 new first line supervisors are in place across my structure to try and support my police officers and staff and the custodies.
Mr. Seale, you wanted
I mean, largely at the death, the Chief Superintendent gave a nod to the points that I was about to highlight. There is an acceptance and an agreement across the service that many of these PC-led centres should have supervisors. Whilst Mr. McEwan has not said it, it's the issue of finance that's prevented that from happening. I think sometimes that the service is very good about talking about posts and deletions of posts without actually talking about people. The simple fact is that in many of these areas there is a desire to put sergeants back into what is currently a PC-led centre, and there is an acknowledgement that but for finance they wouldn't have been taken out in the first place.
I'm not convinced sergeants are the right solution to this. I actually think the role of the CJPCSO team leader is the solution, which is a police staff supervisor, but I don't know if Lucille has a view on that.
Yeah, just to clarify, we are talking about like PC and a PCSO working together and being remotely managed by a sergeant somebody else. Yes, I think that staff, both police and the support staff member, find that difficult. I think they feel lack of support there. And I know that in some of the reports that we've had, the sergeant who's doing the supervision, he's not totally content because they can't see the prisoner on camera. It's not clear enough. I'm definitely a fan, obviously, of team leader in the new structure, and we are looking at that. We have a job description for that. We're about to review it, etc. So I would certainly say there should be more hands-on. I think either the cameras need to improve greatly or more in, but it's not an ideal situation when you've got a sergeant sitting who is supervising, who's supposed to speak to the prisoner, and he can't get a clear picture. And staff definitely in this, I keep saying about high-risk area, but they definitely need to feel supported.
Okay, we hear that very clearly. Thank you. James.
Okay, thank you, Convener. The SPF have stated that there's a perception that the number of custodies that are requiring constant observation are on the increase. So can I ask Callum Steele if he feels that there's an optimum number of staff that are required for health and safety purposes around these observations that need, constant observation.
I rather fear we're going to be defeated by time, given the very clear steer that was provided by the convener at the start. The difficulty, of course, is that the issue of observations is varied and it's a graduated scale. I think it's 1, 2, 3 and 4, if memory serves me right. And it's those that are at the grade 4 level of supervision that demand the greatest level of intervention. And in some cases, the risk assessment that are made by the service are made in good faith, although in some cases medical professionals may not necessarily agree with the assessment that's being undertaken. If I may very quickly give an example, someone presenting at a charge bar who says that they may have in the past self-harmed, that may result in some kind of assessment that they may be suicidal or a risk of suicidal, meaning they get a very high level of response, even though there may be no level or indication that they're going to self-harm at this particular point in time. Another, very quickly, is someone who has reported that they may be prone to fitting or taking seizures. Well, the service generally takes a risk view that this is something that they need to keep a really close eye on, despite the fact that in their day-to-day populace there are epileptics walking around who may never have another fit, but they've taken them in the past. So it's a difficult thing to put a specific number on, other than the fact that the risk that custody has to assess is one which is invidious. I'm absolutely clear about that. And unless and until such time as there's a willingness to invest wholesale in the requirements of custody, the backfilling requirements are always going to be there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we just need to be very careful with constant obs, because we are doing a review on the constant obs, and constant observations in the west are higher than the north and the east, and we're doing a review to try and understand that. But I am being very subtle about this, because if we start to point fingers or challenge my staff on the front line about why you did or did not do constant obs for that, and somebody tragically dies because we never done constant obs because a member of staff is feeling the pressure, I don't want that to happen. So we just need to be very careful about the conversation around constant observations. My staff are highly professional and highly trained, and I empower them and I commend them for the way in which they manage the risk assessments. But we are looking at it, but we're doing it in a very soft way, because I don't want anything tragic to happen.
Okay, can I thank witnesses very much indeed, not just for their written submissions, but also for their full and frank answers today. And I'm sorry that time has crept up on us as quickly as it has. Can I also say that if you felt there was something that you wish to add to any of your submissions, please do so. And it may be that we in turn would want to write to you for further information. So I now move thank you again for all your sessions. We now move into private session. Thank you.